great to be with you guys, even though only virtually for obvious reasons. As you can see from the title, I hope you can see the screen. Can you see the PowerPoint? Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
So,
yes. Perfect.
Yeah. As you can see from the title and from the abstract, if you've read it, it's basically a metaphysics of science talk. There is a lot of metaphysics and a bit of science at the end. And it's basically, my aim is to present some ongoing research in the metaphysics of fundamentality. Let me see if I can manage the screen. Wait. Okay. So the plan is pretty simple. I will first of all introduce the metaphysical issue or issues surrounding fundamentality. Then I will focus on a rather minority approach, which I call metaphysical infinitism, which is basically the idea that reality doesn't have a fundamental bottom level or top level for that matter. It's a very exotic minority view, but I think it's actually a consistent view and it deserves much more attention than it's been given so far. So I will try to discuss with you whether infinitism is understandable, first of all, and secondly, whether it can be used in some scientific context. The application that I want to discuss with you guys, even though I will present it very briefly, is a specific subset of contemporary physics. In particular, I will look at cosmological models, which in a sense go beyond the Big Bang in that they postulate a potentially infinite series of universes. And I think these sort of theories can be made sense by applying metaphysical infinitism. So potentially this is a sort of novel interplay between analytic metaphysics and contemporary physics and philosophy of physics. So this is basically what I want to discuss. And that's basically it. At the end, I will have a very quick summary, and time permitting, I would like to discuss with you guys also more general methodological issue concerning the way in which we should maybe put philosophy and science together. Because I think it's a very complicated issue, and a lot of the things we say in metaphysics on the one hand, in philosophy of science, in philosophy of physics on the other hand, they really depend on what we mean by doing philosophy of science or philosophy of physics. In my case, I'm very much interested in methodological issues surrounding the applicability of metaphysics to science. So time permitting, as I said, if we have time, I would like to hear what you guys think about this particular interplay. Okay, so enough for stage setting. Let's begin discussing the actual stuff. Allora, so metaphysical issue of fundamentality. The starting point here is very well known. It is that reality appears to have a sort of internal organization, an architecture, a structure. And whenever we have, if we have them, genuine metaphysical explanation and theories, they aim to latch onto this architecture. So in contemporary literature, philosophers often talk about ontological priority and dependence, by which they mean basically that, you know, there are some entities and they depend on other entities for their existence, for their properties, for their identity conditions, and so on. Slightly differently, some philosophers talk about grounding, and basically what they mean, even though the precise meaning of the notion is controversial, is basically this: some facts are grounded into other facts, and this means that some facts occur in virtue of other facts. So the idea is that basically there are at least some cases in which ontological dependence and priority relation or grounding relations cannot be reduced to purely, say, physical or biological relation. In those cases, we have space for genuine metaphysical explanation. So I'm assuming that there is this autonomous space of metaphysical explanation, and that in particular, we should ask what this general, very fundamental structure of reality looks like if we do have these grounding relations at the very bottom of reality. So the question is very simple. What does such structure look like? What can we say about it? Well, the usual, very intuitive, obviously entrenched in common sense answer is twofold. First of all, the basic architecture of reality is hierarchical. It is vertical. It goes from something fundamental to something less fundamental. Or the other way around. We have certain levels which are less fundamental than others, and they are grounded in these more fundamental levels. The second basic assumption is that reality has a fundamental level, by which we mean one or more things which are so fundamental that they ground everything else, but they are not grounded in anything else, okay? So this is the starting point. And of course, this is pretty familiar, and it's usually called metaphysical foundationalism. And of course, the most well-known formulation of it is atomism. It's basically the pluralistic form of foundationalism, according to which there are many entities at the fundamental level. In particular, if we accept atomism, these fundamental entities are related to less fundamental entities by mereological part-whole relations. But notice that this need not be the case. Foundationalism doesn't have to be a mereological thesis. It is more general. What we can say is that in this pluralistic formulation, atomism is probably the most familiar view, at least in Western philosophy. But notice that foundationalism could be formulated in a different way. We have, on the one hand, pluralism, and of course, the other option is monism. According to monistic foundationalism, there is only one all-encompassing fundamental entity, which obviously reminds us of the Parmenidean cosmos, or in a different tradition, of the idealistic absolute. There is only one entity, and it comprises everything else. Now, this is pretty much well known, and it's so intuitive that basically philosophers take it for granted. But what I've been interested in lately is the fact that foundationalism is not obviously true. Actually, it's not the only option, and there are alternatives. So what I've been doing is basically trying to flesh out these alternatives in more detail. What do they look like? This probably reminds you, if you are familiar with it, of the debate in epistemology about justification. So the debate there is basically, we have beliefs, we want these beliefs to be justified, and then the question arises, when does justification stop? So as you probably know, some people said, look, you start with your beliefs, you ask for justification, you get to other facts, other beliefs, and at some point, you need to get to a bottom level in which you have things that are self-evident. So they don't need justification. And this is obviously the epistemological counterpart of foundationalism. Now, my initial intuition in this sense started from the fact that, look, in epistemology, you have at least two alternatives. On the one hand, we have the Quinean view according to which beliefs actually support each other in sort of horizontal webs. So there is no hierarchy of justification. You have a sort of coherent set of beliefs. Now, in the metaphysical case, I thought maybe we have something similar. And indeed, metaphysical coherentism is the view that allows for symmetric and reflexive dependence relations. So coherentism basically drops both the hierarchy and the fundamental level assumptions. So what we get in metaphysics is something like these interconnected webs where each part depends on the other, on all the others, which very much reminds us of these engravings by a famous artist like this one. And however, there is a third option. Suppose, again, let's begin with beliefs. Suppose you have a belief, you want to justify it. And then you justify it on the basis of some more fundamental facts and beliefs. But suppose you never stop asking for justification. Epistemological infinitists accept that this is a coherent picture. And actually they add something. They say, well, look, there is no point in which you can simply say that, you know, this is self-evident, I can stop here. Whenever you think you can stop, that is really arbitrary. So according to infinitism, you need, at least in principle, you need to be able to keep asking for justification. So in this case, the thought is, well, maybe in metaphysics, something similar may happen. And indeed, metaphysical infinitism allows for bottomless or topless or both bottomless and topless chains of dependence. So what we have here is we preserve the hierarchy assumption and we drop the fundamentality assumption. And the resulting picture is something like this well-known traditional picture of the world, whereby basically the universe rests upon the back of a giant tortoise, and the tortoise is itself supported by another tortoise, and the next tortoise is already itself supported by another tortoise, and so on. So you get the idea, right? If we try to think in different ways, maybe foundationalism is not so obvious. Things might be interconnected with each other, or maybe you only have infinite chains of dependence. So as I said, my focus today will be on the second option, even though coherentism is something that I really like. I've been working on it quite a bit lately. But today I will focus on infinitism, which is possibly an even less popular view. Okay, so let me characterize infinitism a bit more. The basic intuition is pretty old. I found this fragment from Anaxagoras, and he seems to have a clearly infinitist intuition here. He says there is no smallest among the small and no largest among the large, but always something still smaller and something still larger. This is basically, again, in meteorological terms, we don't need to put too much stress on that. But the basic intuition is an infinitist intuition. Why do we have to think exactly that there is something fundamental? So on the other hand, the view is pretty old, but it's not very popular, as I said. So the first thing we need to ask is whether the view is actually tenable. Isn't it internally contradictory to, you know, ask for foundations and then end up with infinitism? So this is the main thing we have to discuss. And after that, supposing that I will convince you that the answer is affirmative, then there is at least a second issue. Does the view have some form of applicability in some domains of philosophy or maybe science? And these two issues is basically what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes or so. So let's start with the first issue. As you may have imagined, the obvious objection here is a vicious regress objection. I call it the vicious regress of being objection. And the thought is pretty simple. It is well expressed by Leibniz, for example, when he claims, look, if there are only beings by aggregation, namely things that are not simple, then whatever object you take, it will not have any reality at all. Because each being of which it is composed must be itself a being for which we must still seek for the grounds. Grounds, however, which we can never be found in this way because we must always continue to seek for them. So basically, Leibniz says, what we are looking is a starting point, a basis for being. And if you are an infinitist, you don't get that. So nothing can exist. This is the idea. There is a vicious regress, maybe simply because it's an infinite regress. But supposing that there are some non-vicious infinite regresses, this one seems to be vicious regress. And basically the same idea has been expressed by Schaffer much more recently. Schaffer begins with the same analogy with epistemology that I suggested a moment ago. And he concludes like this: there must be a ground of being. If one thing exists only in virtue of another, then there must be something from which the reality of the derivative entities ultimately derives. So you can see the intuition is exactly the same, right? If we start asking for grounds and we move on, say, backwards, we need to stop at some point. There must be some source of being. And of course, this is exactly the intuition that I want to resist. But before I do that, let me add something. Sometimes the same objection, more or less, is formulated in the principle of sufficient reason. Leibniz is not very precise about it, and there is a lot of debate about how to best interpret the principle. Very believe that, you know, the principle of sufficient reason really leads us to foundationalism. And this is pretty clear, for example, in the work of Dasgupta. Maybe you know the guy. He actually says that, you know, the right way of understanding the principle of sufficient reason is like this: every substantive fact must have an autonomous ground. What does he mean by substantive and autonomous? Well, not surprisingly, he means there are some facts which are substantive in the sense that they're apt for being grounded. We can sensibly ask, what is it in virtue of which these facts occur? But, says Dasgupta, on the other hand, we have autonomous facts, which are simply the basis or the starting point of everything else. And this is, of course, simply a reformulation of foundationalism. It is right, we always need to be able to ask for explanations, but at some point we need to get to something which is not explicable. So not surprisingly, Dasgupta says something really strongly against infinitism. All we have in a non-terminating descending chain is infinitely many bad answers. Okay, so there is a lot to say about this, and I will have to be pretty quick for reasons of time. So my short reply here is that this is wrong. And it is wrong for a number of reasons. I'll try to be brief, but it's important that you get the basic idea. First reason is very general. The thought is, look, if you read Leibniz, if you read Schaffer, if you read Dasgupta, basically it is not clear what the argument is. They basically claim that it is obvious or something like self-evident that if you ask for grounds and you never stop at something which is not explicable any longer, then that's a bad regress. And I think this is not an argument. This is basically intuition. And as you all agree, I think intuition is not always a good guide for philosophers. We need to have a clear argument. On top of this, I think there might be an ambiguity here between two levels, which is very important to keep separated, namely the ontological level of being and the epistemological level of what is conceivable, what we can do with our minds. In a slogan, what I want to say next is that ontological completeness, the fact that something exists with determinate properties, determinate identity, does not always coincide with epistemic completeness, by which I mean the ability to go through a process of deconstruction in our minds. So this might be a bit too vague now. So let's look at examples. Examples like a geometric line, for instance. If you think about a line, you know that by definition, the line has an infinite number of points in it, right? But we all agree that lines exist. We can draw segments. We don't need to reject the conceivability of geometric lines just because we are not in a position to draw a line point by point, right? It's simply two different levels. One thing is the way in which we understand things, And another thing is, the way in which reality is. So it seems to me that, foundationalists might be led by this intuition that there must be a coincidence between ontology and epistemology in this sense. But we have a number of cases in which this is not the case. Next example, take any convergent series in mathematics like this. You're probably familiar with it. You know that this is an infinite series, but it is complete because we know that the end result is 1. So in a sense, we have ontological completeness here, but we are not, in principle, we are unable to go through the process and adding the last number. It simply makes no sense. So by the same token, in metaphysics, we might start thinking, well, look, it could be, for instance, that, say, an infinite time has passed until now, even though, of course, I cannot mentally go back through the whole history before me. So in the end, what I'm saying is that it could be that the foundationalist is not paying enough attention to this. Epistemic limitations need not always be indicative of constraints on reality, which is basically the sort of conflation that is at play, I think, in Zeno's paradoxes that you probably know. If you start thinking about reality in terms of what you can conceive, then maybe you miss something. Okay, moving on. Third and last point I want to make before moving on. It is also very important, I think, that we keep distinct and separated 2 different levels of discourse, 2 different, even ontological levels. I call them the global level and the local level. What do I mean by this? Well, there is one global question, which is basically the most general question we can ask. It is the global question as to why the universe exists. The very well-known, famous question, why something rather than nothing? Now, the foundationalist thought could be, well, look, infinitists want to answer this, but they are unable to, because they keep on going backwards, and we never get an answer to the global question. But look, the same goes for foundationalists, because they go back until they get to the fundamental ungrounded basis, and for that, we don't get an answer. So my worry here is that we are missing the point. What we want to answer is not the global question as to why the universe exists. Instead, what is relevant, both for foundationalists and infinitists, is what I call local questions. You have a local questions whenever you want to ask a question like, what is the ground for this specific fact? Say the fact that my laptop is gray and black. The fact that, there are 11 people listening to me. These are local questions. And this is the questions that are relevant. Now, if this is the case, then things are completely the other way around. Actually, it seems to me that if we take infinitism seriously, then every local question always finds an explanation, while this is not the case in the foundationalist case. Because, of course, foundationalists have at least one thing which is not explained, which is the fundamental basis. So in a sense, to put these ideas graphically, let's go back to Dasgupta and this distinction between substantive and autonomous facts. The idea for the foundationalist is this: you need to have a chain of substantive facts which can be grounded, and the chain itself has to include something which is not grounded, something autonomous, like this red thing here. What I'm saying is that infinitists change the picture altogether, and what we get is an infinite chain of substantive facts, each one of which can in principle be explained. And this is a better way of going to towards explanations for local questions. But look, the whole chain itself can be regarded now as the autonomous fact in Dasgupta's sense. But I think this is a good thing, because the autonomous fact is not arbitrarily inserted within the chain. It is just the fact that you have an infinite chain. So maybe we can discuss this later. This is the basic difference. And I think if we get this, then the regress objection fails, because we do have something that really grounds everything else. But it is the infinite chain itself. And what we get in exchange is the fact that we don't need to posit a ground for which in principle there is no explanation. Okay, I hope you get at least a very general idea. Let's move on to the physics now. Now, the starting point here is pretty different. It has to do with actual theories, even though pretty unpopular views. There is a family of views in particular that deny the uniqueness of the universe. And they do so with the aim of explaining things that are supposedly left unexplained by the Big Bang model. Now, what is important to stress is that they are not alternatives to the Big Bang. The Big Bang model is not abandoned. Rather, we have what are called multiverse cosmologies, which are basically theories that posit something over and beyond the Big Bang. Okay, so what is it that we are supposed to explain by going multiverse? Well, at least three things: the origin of the universe, the idea that the Big Bang started from an initial singularity. You probably know what it is. A singularity is a physical situation in which you have physical quantities becoming infinite, which is very bad for physicists, and physicists really want to avoid infinite quantities whenever possible. And now the funny thing is that the Big Bang starts from a singularity. And if we could avoid this, it would be nice. A third achievement, or supposed achievement, of multiverse cosmologies is the fact that there are some specific features of our universe, and in particular some parameters and the fact that the laws of nature seem to be conducive to life as we know it, which are pretty striking. You know probably the basic idea behind fine-tuning anthropic reasoning, right? The idea is that, you know, the universe is complex. There are a number of constants, parameters, and laws, and they could have been slightly different. And if they had been slightly different, we wouldn't be here. So it is particularly striking that, you know, there is only one universe exactly with the parameters required for life. And many people took this fine-tuning as a good reason for believing in an intelligent design, in an intelligent creator. But now if we go multiverse, apparently we can explain away this fine-tuning intuition. So let me put this differently. If we accept the idea that there is something more than the Big Bang history we are familiar with, then we get an explanation of the origin of the universe, because the beginning is now itself explained in terms of other physical events in a larger history. The initial singularity, at least in some cases, is explained away because we posit other physical events before the Big Bang. We can avoid claiming that the Big Bang had to start off with these infinite quantities. So this is connected to the more technical features of the physical theories. We won't get into the details of this. But the basic point has to be clear. It is by going beyond the Big Bang that you can explain these things. Otherwise, they are just primitives. As for fine-tuning, as I said, the apparently fine-tuned laws and parameters and quantities become just one possibility among many if we believe in a multiverse, right? Because, of course, it is surprising that the constants of nature and the parameters and the laws are exactly like this, but not so much, because, you know, you have other universes with other parameters, and in those universes, maybe life is not possible. But this is just to be expected. Okay, I hope you get the basic idea now, because we are really strict on time. So what I'm going to do next is briefly look at a couple of examples, different ways of endorsing multiverse theory, and try to show you some connections with metaphysical infinities. First example, Roger Penrose's cyclic conformal cosmology. This is just an example. There are other theories like some versions of loop quantum cosmology, which have the same sort of basic idea. Very, very roughly, the idea in this case is that these theories are such that the temporal beginning or end of the universe come to coincide with the final or initial instant of another universe, or at least of a new stage of our universe. And by doing this, we get to explain 1 and 2 above, namely the origin and the singularities in the Big Bang. If we look more closely, let me check the chat in just a second. Okay, thank you. Yes, sorry, I'm going a bit long, but there is a lot of stuff. Okay, so yeah, 3 minutes, I'll do my best. Now, regardless of the details, in Penrose's model, what we are told is that, you know, there is an infinite sequence of universes. Each one of these universes lasts for an infinite time, what Penrose calls a eon. So you get something like this picture here. There is a Big Bang with a starting and an end, but each one of these endpoint or starting point are connected to other bits of the same multiverse sequence. And it seems to me that it is clear that a metaphysical infinitism is the right metaphysical background for this kind of view, if we want to have a metaphysics for our physical theories. In a sense, this might be understood in a way similar to the steady state view of the universe. Maybe some of you know it, which is basically the view that the universe itself does not become, it just is. But within the universe, in this case, within this huge infinite cylinder, you have all the physical going on. So that was very sketchy, but it is one potential connection between metaphysical infinitism and multiverse cosmology. Another example, very quickly, slightly different. Liz Mollin has been working on this idea of natural cosmological selection for 20, 25 years now. And again, these ideas can be found in other physical theories. Now, in this case, multiverse theories are postulated with the idea that more or less in the same sense as in Darwin's biology case, literally universes recreate themselves. You have descendant universes. And the idea here is that this happens through black holes, right? And we will look at details in the next slide. The explananda here are again the origin of the universe and the initial singularity, but in particular the fine-tuning. So very briefly, what Mollin in particular says is that we have something like this picture. This is just part of the picture, of course. You have a universe and you have the evolution of a star. In some cases, you get a black hole, and in that particular black hole, the conditions may happen for a new Big Bang. So you have maybe a new singularity, maybe not, but what is important is that you have a new whole universe, possibly with a concomitant variation of physical laws and constants. Is that instead of an infinite sequence of Big Bang histories, you have new universes being created within the black holes in other universes. And according to Mollin, this is the mechanism that explains the variability of laws of nature and constants and so on. Now, what I wanted to stress is that in this case, we have something slightly different from what happened in Penrose's case. It seems to me that in this case, what we have is something like a matryoshka-like meteorological structure with nested universes. So like the Russian dolls, you have a universe at one scale. Within the black hole of this one or more black holes in this universe, you have potentially new rescaled universes. Now, this is very highly speculative, and according to some models, so-called fractal cosmologies, maybe these part-whole relations repeat themselves more or less in the same way at all scales. But independently of this, I think that even if we don't buy into this fractal story, again, it seems to me that if we want to take seriously this sort of multiverse idea, then again, metaphysical infinitism might be a good philosophical background. Maybe in this case, it's not really what I call diachronic or temporal infinitism. It's not so much a sequential process. What counts in this case, it seems to me, is compositional structure. The fact that a universe contains another universe, which contains another universe, and so on. And in this case, I call it synchronic infinitism, just to stress the fact that, look, compositional meteorological structure is what should be explained in the first place. It's a bit like, you know, Anaxagoras' intuition that I mentioned at the beginning. Couldn't it be that at a given instant, a tiny bit of matter is such that it is constituted by infinitely many proper parts, each one with further proper parts and so on. This need not be an history in time. What it is important now is this meteorological structure. Anyway, just to close, there is an open question that we might want to discuss. The question is simple. Wouldn't large numbers do as well? This is an objection that sometimes can be found in the literature. If this were the case, then of course, by Occam's razor or a principle of economy, then we should avoid positing infinities. And if this is the case, then of course the foundationalists might be right after all. Now, I disagree with this, but I will only give you a very provisional response to start the debate. Well, wouldn't large numbers do as well? I think it depends on what you want to explain. So it seems to me, for example, that in Smolin's case, a finite plurality of universes would be enough. That's true. We can account for this variation of constants and laws and for this apparent fine-tuning by simply thinking that, you know, there is more than one universe and every universe has a different set of constants and laws. But what about the problem of the origin? If we go for a finite plurality, then again, it seems to me we need to explain why exactly that universe is the starting point. More generally, if we go for more than one but less than infinity, we need to posit a given number of universes. But then the question arises exactly as to why n universes rather than n+1 or -1. So the basic idea that I'd like to discuss is basically this. You know, Occam's razor, fine, but economy may not be the only criterion. In some cases, our demands for explanations may be better satisfied by going infinities after all. Because if we insist with foundationalism, it could be that some things that really could have been explained, we just take them for granted as primitive brute facts. So in conclusion, I will not read the quotation. It could be that Pascal is right. You know, if you take any man looking at the most minute parts of the universe, it could be that Pascal was right, that, you know, upon reflection, he will find the same structure inside the most minute insect. And again, within the structure, again, all that he first had, finding still in these others the same thing without end and without cessation. This is really infinitism in Pascal. So I will just show you the concluding summary. As I said at the beginning, I had an addendum about the methodology, but maybe we can discuss it later. I'll just show you the slide. Basically, I wanted to tell you that this is a sort of case study in what I call moderately naturalistic metaphysics, which is a sort of third way between two extremes that I think are implausible. On the one hand, obviously, the sort of metaphysics that simply doesn't care about science. That's bad. I think we can all agree with that. But I think it's also bad to be a radical naturalist. It's something that philosophers tend to be more and more, which basically is the idea that science speaks for itself. We don't need philosophy. And I think moderate naturalism could be a sensible middle way. But as I said, I'll just show you the picture and we can discuss it later. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Matteo, for this